I remember the way he walked through the front door that evening, as if nothing had changed, as if the world outside had not shifted on its axis without my permission. The soft click of his shoes against the hardwood floor echoed through the quiet house, mingling with the faint scrape of the doorframe as he squeezed through. Ordinary sounds, familiar, comforting even, but that night, they carried a weight that had nothing to do with the day, nothing to do with our life as I thought I knew it. Each step he took seemed deliberate, measured, as though he were preparing for the impact of what was about to come. His hands were full of flowers, lilies, white lilies. Their pale petals reached upward, elegant and delicate, like tiny hands trying to touch the ceiling, as though they wanted to escape the confines of the vase, just as my thoughts were beginning to feel trapped in the confines of this moment. I remembered, with a sharp, almost painful clarity, that these were the same flowers I had once bought for him on our first date. The memory was so vivid that it almost felt like déjà vu. The nervous excitement, the soft laughter, the smell of rain on the asphalt outside the cafe where we had shared our first coffee. And now, years later, he carried the same flowers, but the meaning had shifted. The lilies no longer spoke of beginnings. They were fragile witnesses to the ending. I smiled. I thought I was smiling for him, but perhaps I was smiling at the memory of myself, the woman who had once believed in forever, who had imagined a lifetime of shared mornings, whispered secrets, and the comfort of a hand held in the dark. My hand rose instinctively, reaching for his, as if the touch could tether him to me, to the life we had built together. But he didn't notice. Perhaps he did notice, and had chosen not to. Perhaps he had always known that this touch would never be enough to stop the inevitable. He placed the flowers on the counter with a careful hand. I watched the vase wobble slightly, like a delicate ship caught in the sudden storm of our silence. And then, he handed me something else. Something heavier than the bouquet, heavier than the air in the room, heavier than the weight of all our shared memories. Paper. Divorce papers. Read them, he said, and his voice was calm, almost gentle, yet I could detect a tremor beneath the surface, a tremor I could not name. His eyes avoided mine, as though meeting them might undo all the rehearsed composure, as though our gaze would shatter the fragile balance between us. I took the papers in my hands. They felt unreal, heavier than paper should ever feel, pressing coldly against my palms. I inhaled, and the sterile smell of ink, the faint acrid odor of printer toner, filled my nostrils. The scent was sharp, clinical, final, and as I read the words, the reality of them pressed into me like ice water. This is the end. This marriage is dissolved. A strange, surreal part of me wanted to laugh. Another part wanted to scream so loudly that the walls themselves might crumble. Yet another part simply wanted to collapse onto the floor and let the world fall away. But I did none of these things. I stared at him, at the bouquet, at the folded sheets that contained the undoing of a life I thought I had secured. I studied the lilies again, noticing how the petals had already begun to curl slightly, delicate edges folding inward like the closing fist of grief. Their fragility mirrored my own. I thought of the mornings we had shared, long ago and recently alike, the clink of coffee cups, the warmth of our hands brushing across the table, the quiet comfort of our unspoken companionship. I remembered the nights of laughter, of whispered dreams, of promises made in the gentle glow of the bedroom lamp. And in that moment, I realized how delicate happiness is, how swiftly it can be crushed, how easily life can turn from soft, golden light into shadow. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. Minutes felt like hours, seconds felt like eternity. I traced the lines on the counter with trembling fingers, trying to anchor myself to something familiar, while the room itself seemed to tilt and shift. I wanted to reach out and speak, to ask why, to demand some explanation that would make sense of the senseless, but the words would not form. My voice felt swallowed by the gravity of the moment, caught somewhere between memory and shock, between disbelief and dawning understanding. I remembered our early years together, the late-night rides when the city was quiet, the smell of rain on the asphalt, and his cologne mingling in the car, the small apartment where we had first learned the rhythms of each other's breathing, the kitchen where we had danced in socks to songs nobody else could hear. Every memory was a dagger wrapped in velvet, soft and comforting, yet sharp and piercing. And now, those memories were both mine and inaccessible, like photographs behind glass that I could touch but never reclaim. That night, I lay awake on the bed that had once been ours. The wind scratched at the windows, whispering secrets I was not ready to hear. The ticking of the clock was unbearably loud. Tick, tick, tick. Each second pounded against my chest, an unrelenting reminder that life marched forward, indifferent to heartbreak, impervious to grief. Somewhere deep in the darkness, I whispered the question that had been forming in my mind since he handed me the papers. Is this really happening? And somewhere else, perhaps a quieter, hidden part of me, I wondered if I had known it all along. Had I seen the signs? The late nights he claimed were work, that smelled faintly of someone else's perfume? The growing distance, the quiet walls between us that I had chosen not to acknowledge? Had I suspected, feared even, but convinced myself it wasn't true because the alternative, confronting the end, was too unbearable? I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks and imagining them as the fractures in our life, the ones I had tried so hard to ignore. I thought of the flowers again, their white petals a cruel contrast to the weight of the papers. Life had become absurd, a cruel mixture of beauty and devastation, and I realized that love, no matter how enduring, can sometimes be a fragile thing, shattered not by betrayal alone, but by the quiet, inevitable erosion of connection over time. I remembered his smile when he first gave me those same flowers, years ago, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the warmth of his hand in mine. And I saw the difference now. That smile had become a mask, a practiced gesture, a ghost of the man I had married. I could not blame him entirely. Perhaps we had both been actors, performing a play neither of us wanted to end, pretending that time, love, and life would stretch infinitely before us. I curled into myself, pulling the blanket close, as if it could shield me from the enormity of what had just happened. The smell of lilies mingled with the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the kitchen, a sensory memory that seemed almost cruel in its persistence. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the world, to hold on to the fragments of warmth and safety that once existed. And yet, even in the darkness, even in the ache that had taken up residence in my chest, a small, quiet part of me began to notice something else. The emptiness. The space that had always been there, hidden beneath years of routine, obligations, and unspoken resentments. Perhaps this was a chance, not yet, not immediately, but somewhere in the fragile future. A chance to reclaim the life that had slipped through my fingers. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I lay awake, listening to the wind, to the soft sighs of the house settling, to the distant hum of the city. Every tick of the clock reminded me that time would not stop, that life, despite heartbreak, would continue. And in that relentless continuation, I found the first faint, almost imperceptible stirrings of resilience. I whispered once more, softly, almost to myself, I will survive this. And in that whisper, I realized survival was the first step towards something I had almost forgotten. Hope. The next morning, the house felt foreign, as though I had woken inside someone else's life. Even the sunlight seemed cautious, hesitant to spill into corners, It had once illuminated freely, casting soft, familiar warmth on the kitchen floor. Now it tiptoed around the furniture, timid, unsure, afraid of the tension that lingered like smoke from a long-extinguished fire. I walked through the room slowly, almost reverently, my hands brushing along the edges of the kitchen counter. Worn smooth from years of breakfast plates and hurried mornings, I touched the faded floral curtains, their cotton frayed at the edges, carrying the faint smell of dust and long-past summers. I ran my fingers over the scratches etched into the dining table, reminders of spilled coffee, moving chairs, and careless moments that had once seemed charming. Every touch carried memory, every memory a ghost hovering, reminding me of what had been lost. I sat at the kitchen table, the divorce papers still resting in front of me. I stared at them as though they were a puzzle I could somehow solve, a riddle that might undo the cruel finality of their words. I tried to remember a time when silence wasn't an uninvited guest in our home. I tried to summon the laughter we had shared, the easy chatter over morning coffee, the whispered conversations that stretched into the night. And he had answered, but only half-truths, words that left more questions than they resolved. I had nodded. I had pretended it didn't matter, pretending the truth wasn't bleeding through the cracks of our life. Pretending made it bearable, at least for a little while. But the truth now was undeniable. It was written in black and white, concrete, inked on paper. Divorce. I wandered into the bedroom, the room heavy with the smell of his cologne that lingered long after he had left. I ran my hands along his shirts, lingering over the fabric, tracing the seams, feeling the ghost of the warmth that had once been mine. My fingers trembled, brushing against the texture that had once been ordinary, comforting. I pressed one of his shirts to my cheek, inhaling deeply, letting the scent carry me back to 1,000 quiet evenings and mornings we had spent together. And then tears came, slow at first, then in streams, sliding down my cheeks like invisible rivers, each drop a note in a symphony of grief that filled the room with silent music. The world outside carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars honked, tires splashing in puddles, the wind rattled the windows, and children's laughter echoed faintly from the street. Their joy, ordinary and unthinking, was almost unbearable in its contrast to my own inner silence. Inside, my world had stopped. Time itself seemed to stall, the air thick and heavy, as if the walls of our home were holding their breath in solidarity with my sorrow. I walked the house again, from room to room, each step a journey through memory and loss. The echo of goodbye had begun its slow, insidious work, reverberating in hallways, lingering in empty chairs, whispering in corners where light used to fall freely. I realized then that these echoes would follow me long after the papers had been signed, long after the last phone call had ended. They would inhabit every corner of my life, shaping me, reminding me of love lost, of trust broken, of endings that felt like earthquakes tearing through the foundation of everything I had built. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the window. The sunlight streamed in, soft but pale, and I noticed the way the dust motes danced in the light, delicate, fleeting, fragile. I envied them, their impermanence, their freedom from the weight of history. I envied the way they floated, untethered by human expectation or heartbreak. I thought about the mornings we had shared, now gone. The smell of coffee brewing, the quiet hum of our small kitchen, the way our hands would brush accidentally and linger just a moment too long. I remembered the whispered promises made in half-dark rooms, the laughter we shared over ridiculous movies, the mundane conversations that had once felt sacred because they were ours. And I realized that what had once been ordinary was now lost, and in its absence, a vacuum had formed, echoing with what could have been. I wandered toward the living room, trailing my fingers along the spines of books we had read together, the jackets of board games stacked neatly in the corner, relics of a life that now felt borrowed. The room smelled faintly of his scent, mixed with the fading perfume of the lilies he had brought the night before, their petals drooping, curling inward like fragile shields against the inevitable. I felt a hollow pang in my chest, a longing for something that had already vanished, a mourning for moments I could never retrieve. Sitting there, I realized that grief has its own rhythm, its own cadence. It is not sudden or explosive, but slow, creeping, insidious, wrapping itself around your heart like ivy climbing a wall. The echo of goodbye had already settled in, a presence more tangible than the absence of his body. It whispered reminders in quiet moments, the empty chair at the breakfast table, the brush of his jacket in the closet, the sound of the wind rattling the window pane as though speaking in his voice. I wanted to scream into the empty house, to shatter the walls with my pain. I wanted someone to acknowledge the enormity of it, to see that a life had ended even as the world carried on unaware. But no one came. Only the echoes remained, murmuring softly in response to my sorrow, neither consoling nor cruel, simply existing, persistent as memory itself. I sank onto the couch, pulling a blanket around me, and let the tears fall freely. The sorrow was heavy, a tangible weight pressing on my chest. Yet in that heaviness was also clarity. The truth had been revealed. The marriage was over. The man I had loved had chosen to leave. And now, the task before me was both impossible and inevitable. To live in a house that was no longer home, to exist in a life that had been irrevocably altered, and to navigate the long, winding path of grief that stretched ahead. Even as the morning light shifted across the floorboards, I understood something profound. The echo of goodbye was not a single note, not a fleeting sound. It was a chorus, a resonance that would linger in every room, in every object, in every memory. It would follow me through years, shaping me, teaching me, reminding me that love, once lost, leaves an imprint that nothing can erase. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief, beneath the hollow ache of absence, I felt a flicker of something tentative, a spark that whispered of resilience, of endurance, of the possibility of finding myself again in a world where the echoes of goodbye no longer defined me entirely. Days began to pass with a strange rhythm, not fast enough to carry me away from the pain, yet not slow enough to let me catch my breath. They blurred together, gray and muted, like watercolor paint that had been thinned too much. Mornings arrived without enthusiasm, evenings came without comfort, and somewhere in between I existed, not quite living, not quite grieving, just floating in the hollow space between what was and what would never be again. Every hallway, every corner of the house seemed alive with whispers of him. When I moved through them, the air felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sometimes I would stop halfway down the corridor and just listen to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the floorboards beneath my feet, the faint sigh of wind slipping through a crack in the window frame. And in those moments, it almost felt like the house was speaking in his voice, not with words, but with memory. I caught glimpses of him everywhere, in the reflection on the window pane when dusk settled, in the shimmer of the kitchen faucet as I rinsed a cup, in the darkened hallway mirror that seemed to trap ghosts instead of reflections. Sometimes I thought I saw movement behind me, the familiar outline of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, and my heart would leap before my mind reminded me that he was gone. But the hardest reflection to face was my own. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, her eyes hollow and ringed with sleeplessness, her hair tangled, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She looked like she had aged years in just a few days. There was something raw about her, stripped of the illusions she once wore like armor. I studied her face as if it belonged to someone else, and wondered how long it had been since I'd truly recognized myself. I tried to keep busy. I told myself that movement might dull the ache. So I busied my hands with small comforts: the whistle of the kettle in the morning, the rhythmic folding of laundry, the scent of lemon from freshly wiped counters. I sat by the window and watched the rain tap gently against the glass, the droplets racing each other down the pane like tiny fragile lives. My cat, a soft ball of warmth and indifference, would curl into my lap, his gentle purr filling the silence like a lullaby meant for someone else. And yet, even those small moments, the sound of the kettle, the rain, the purr, felt temporary, fragile, as if they could vanish with a single shift in the air, leaving behind only the stillness I feared most. At night, I would sit in bed, tracing the outline of his absence on the sheets. I remembered how he used to turn over in his sleep, mumbling half-formed dreams. I sat by the window and watched the rain tap gently against the glass, the droplets racing each other down the pane like tiny fragile lives. My cat, a soft ball of warmth and indifference, would curl into my lap, his gentle purr filling the silence like a lullaby meant for someone else. And yet, even those small moments, the sound of the kettle, the rain, the purr, felt temporary, fragile, as if they could vanish with a single shift in the air, leaving behind only the stillness I feared most. At night, I would sit in bed, tracing the outline of his absence on the sheets. I remembered how he used to turn over in his sleep, mumbling half-formed dreams. I remembered the way he would reach for me without waking, his hand resting on my hip, grounding me. Now, there was only the cool emptiness of the space he once occupied, the faint indentation in the mattress fading a little more each day. Memories came uninvited, arriving in waves that alternated between tenderness and pain. I remembered our arguments, sharp words thrown like stones, silences that lasted longer than they should have. I remembered apologies that went unspoken, swallowed by pride or fear. I remembered quiet dinners where we pretended to be content, forks clinking softly against plates, our eyes fixed anywhere but on each other. I remembered laughing once, unexpectedly, over something trivial, and how in that brief moment, I had believed we could find our way back. But love, I realized, even when deeply rooted, can wither when starved of honesty. We had spent years tending the garden of our marriage with routine and politeness, convincing ourselves that care was the same as connection. But love doesn't thrive on ritual alone. It needs truth. It needs confrontation. And we had both turned away from that truth, pretending not to see the slow decay. One evening, unable to bear the weight of my own thoughts, I walked slowly down the hallway. The floor creaked beneath my bare feet, the sound loud in the hush of twilight. The walls were lined with photographs, birthdays, vacations, holidays, smiles that once felt effortless. I stopped before each one, tracing my fingertips over the glass, feeling the cool smoothness against my skin. There we were, frozen in time, unknowing of what would come. His arm around my waist, my face tilted toward his shoulder. Both of us looking into the camera with the kind of confidence that only people who believe in forever can have. I wondered if those versions of us would recognize who we had become. I wondered if they'd pity us or forgive us. And then I asked myself, did he remember me that way? Or had I only remembered myself in him? The thought hollowed me out. For so long, I had defined myself by how he saw me, how he loved me, how I fit into his world. Without that reflection, who was I? Just a shadow of a woman, wandering through a house full of ghosts. The tears came then, sudden and unrestrained, not quiet, not polite. They came in waves, spilling over my face, hot and relentless. My breath hitched, my hands trembled, and I sank against the wall, the cold plaster grounding me, as sobs tore free from somewhere deep, somewhere long buried. The sound filled the hallway, echoing off the photographs, off the empty rooms, until it felt like the house itself was weeping with me. I cried for him, I cried for us, but most of all, I cried for the woman I had been before I forgot how to live without someone else defining me. When the sobs finally subsided, I stayed there for a while. The air damp and heavy. The tears had soaked into the sleeves of my sweater, leaving dark, uneven stains. I could taste the salt of them on my lips, and yet, amid the exhaustion, there was an odd stillness. Not peace exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition. Perhaps, I thought, I had been waiting for this moment all along, waiting for him to leave, not out of cruelty or resentment, but because somewhere deep down, I had known that I needed to rediscover who I was without him, that the only way to find myself again was to lose the life that had kept me small and silent. The hallway stretched before me, lined with memories that no longer belonged to the present. The photographs glimmered faintly in the dim light, and for the first time, I didn't look away. I studied them, not as relics of loss, but as proof that I had lived, that I had once loved fully, even if imperfectly, that the version of me captured there had existed, and that I could, somehow, exist again. I stood there for a long time, until the house settled into its nighttime quiet. The air was cool against my face, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I turned off the hallway light and watched as the shadows swallowed the photographs one by one, until all that remained was darkness. But even in the dark, I could still see them. The ghosts of my former life, the echoes of laughter, the outlines of who I had been, and for the first time, the shadows didn't feel menacing. They felt like company. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what it means to begin again. Not to move on, but to move inward, to search for the quiet, trembling self that had been waiting beneath the noise of years. I didn't know who I would become. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But I knew one thing for certain. I would not let the shadows define me. They could walk beside me, but they would no longer lead. Winter came suddenly, like an uninvited guest who arrived afore the hearth was ready. One day, the trees were bare but defiant, holding their ground beneath the pale sky, and the next, they stood cloaked in white, their branches heavy with the silence of snow. The air changed first, colder, sharper, biting at my skin with invisible teeth. The kind of cold that seeps through walls and bone, settling somewhere deep inside, where warmth used to live. The wind howled through the cracks in the old windows, slipping beneath doors and curling around my ankles. I pulled on scarves, sweaters, coats, layers upon layers, each one a feeble attempt to shield myself, not only from the cold outside, but from the emptiness within. The scarf still carried his scent, faint but distinct, like the memory of a dream that refuses to fade upon waking. It clung to the fibers, that subtle blend of cedar, soap, and something wholly him. Every time I inhaled, the ache in my chest deepened. Outside, the world seemed untouched by grief. Couples walked hand in hand, their laughter rising like warm smoke in the frosty air. Children chased each other through snowdrifts, their joy uncontained, their mittens soaked and forgotten. Their laughter, bright, careless, was a sound so pure it hurt. It reminded me of what I had once believed happiness to be: effortless, ordinary, unthinking. I walked slowly, my boots crunching against the snow, each step a sound of both presence and loss. The city glowed with holiday lights, windows framed with garlands, doorsteps lined with wreaths. And yet, amid all that color and warmth, I felt invisible, a silent figure moving through a world that no longer noticed her. The cold air burned my lungs, but I welcomed the sting. It reminded me I was still here, still capable of feeling something, even if it was pain. As I walked, I realized I wasn't just moving through streets. I was moving through myself, through layers of grief, through the long tunnels of a broken heart that seemed endless but not without direction. Each turn, each breath in the frozen air, felt like passing through another chamber of memory. The places we had once shared looked different now, not hostile, just altered. The cafe on the corner where we used to meet on Saturday mornings still stood, but the laughter that used to fill it no longer belonged to us. The bookstore window displayed a novel I knew he would have loved, and for a moment, I almost stepped inside to buy it, before remembering there was no one to give it to. Loneliness is strange. It doesn't arrive all at once. It gathers slowly, like snow accumulating on rooftops. At first, you barely notice it, a dusting, soft and harmless. But then, before you realize it, it becomes heavy, and you are buried beneath it, struggling to remember what it felt like to be worn. I started journaling that winter. It wasn't planned. I found an old notebook tucked in a drawer, its pages still blank, waiting. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and began to write. At first, it was clumsy. Words stumbled out, uncertain, reluctant to make themselves known. But soon, they began to pour. I wrote about the lilies, how they had withered, and how I hadn't thrown them away, letting them dry until their petals curled inward like fists. I wrote about the papers he had handed me, about the sterile smell of ink and toner that had seemed to choke the air. I wrote about silence, how it filled every room, pressed against the windows, hovered above me as I slept. I wrote about the faint memory of his smile, how even that had begun to fade, not because I wanted it to, but because time demands space for healing. Each sentence became a small exhale, a release. Each page was a step forward, even if it didn't feel like progress at the time. There was something about the act of writing, the sound of the pen scratching across paper, the sight of my own trembling handwriting, that made grief tangible, something I could hold and look at, and eventually set down. I wrote about my anger too, the fury that came without warning, sudden and unrelenting. I was angry at him for leaving, for not fighting harder, for giving up. Angry at myself for not seeing it coming, for being too careful, too quiet, too accommodating. Angry at the universe for allowing something that had once felt so infinite to end in something as ordinary as paperwork. But alongside the anger, there was also tenderness, reluctant at first but growing. I began to write not just about him, but about me, about the woman who had been lost beneath years of compromise and routine, about the girl I had once been before love became a duty. I wrote to her like an old friend I hadn't seen in years. And with each page, I could feel her stirring, faintly, like embers rekindling after a long, cold night. The days were short, the nights impossibly long. I filled them with words, with tea, with music that wrapped around me like a blanket. Sometimes I sat by the window, watching the snow fall silently, each flake drifting with purpose even in its descent. There was a strange peace in the stillness of winter, as if the world itself was pausing, waiting, allowing me to gather what was left of myself. One evening, I lit a candle and turned off every light in the house. The glow flickered softly, throwing long shadows on the walls. Outside, snow was falling again, steady, gentle, patient. I pressed my palm against the cold glass of the window and watched the flakes land, melt, vanish. They were beautiful in their brevity, and in that quiet moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Life could still be beautiful, even when broken. Even when everything familiar had been stripped away. Even when love had ended and silence had taken its place. there was still beauty in the breath, in the light of a single candle, in the steady rhythm of my own heart. It wasn't the same kind of beauty I had known before. It wasn't soft laughter or shared coffee cups or the brush of his hand against mine. It was quieter, more fragile. It lived in the cracks, in the spaces grief had hollowed out. But it was real. I could breathe again. Not deeply, not freely, not yet. But I could breathe. Slowly, carefully, tentatively. And maybe that was enough for now. For the first time in months, I slept without dreaming. When I woke, the world outside was wrapped in white. The snow reflected the morning light, turning everything silver and new. The silence no longer frightened me. It simply was. I stood by the window, a cup of tea warming my hands, and watched as a single bird landed on the fence post. Small, trembling, alive. Its feathers puffed against the cold, its tiny claws gripping the wood. For a moment, it looked around, cautious but unafraid. Then it took flight, vanishing into the pale sky. I smiled. Not a wide smile, not a joyous one, but the kind that comes from the quiet recognition that life, even after devastation, continues. That somehow, in the middle of grief, something inside me had begun to thaw. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day that asks nothing of you. A light outside was pale and unremarkable, filtered through a sky the color of porcelain. I had been cleaning, not out of energy, but restlessness. There are moments in grief when movement feels like survival, when the body needs to do something, anything, to remind itself it still exists. That's how I found the box. It was tucked away at the back of the closet, half buried beneath scarves and old shoes. A simple cardboard box, its corners softened with time. I almost ignored it, thinking it was just another relic from a forgotten season. But when I pulled it out, a faint scent rose. Dust, old paper, and something else. Something achingly familiar. When I lifted the lid, the air seemed to shift. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied together with faded ribbons. Some were sealed, some folded loosely, others still half-written. The ink smudged where tears had once fallen. The paper had yellowed around the edges, soft to the touch, fragile like pressed flowers. I sat down on the floor and stared at them, my heart thudding quietly in my chest. I had forgotten these existed. Or maybe I had chosen to forget. These were the letters I had written in the dark, to him, to myself, to no one. Letters I never had the courage to send. The first one was dated 2 months after he left. The handwriting was smaller then, neater, as if I believed precision could make sense of chaos. You said goodbye like it was nothing, the letter began, like a line rehearsed too many times. I keep wondering if I missed something, if there was a moment when I could have stopped you from closing that door. I could almost see myself sitting there, pen in hand, eyes swollen, writing by the faint light of a bedside lamp. My words then had been desperate, clinging to whatever scraps of reason or explanation I could still imagine existed. I read another, then another. Some were angry, full of questions I had long stopped asking. Why wasn't I enough? How could you love me one day and disappear the next? Others were softer, like apologies whispered into the dark. I hope you're okay. I hope you find what you were looking for. You said goodbye like it was nothing, the letter began, like a line rehearsed too many times. I keep wondering if I missed something, if there was a moment when I could have stopped you from closing that door. I could almost see myself sitting there, pen in hand, eyes swollen, writing by the faint light of a bedside lamp. My words then had been desperate, clinging to whatever scraps of reason or explanation I could still imagine existed. I read another, then another. Some were angry, full of questions I had long stopped asking. Why wasn't I enough? How could you love me one day and disappear the next? Others were softer, like apologies whispered into the dark. I hope you're okay. I hope you find what you were looking for. The letters were not just memories, they were proof of survival. Every sentence was a small defiance against silence. Every paragraph, a heartbeat that refused to stop. As the afternoon light shifted into bold, I gathered the letters around me, a constellation of my former selves. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums rather than echoes. Outside, the wind stirred the branches against the window, but inside, everything felt still. And in that stillness, a realization emerged, soft but clear, like dawn through fog. I had survived it all. The heartbreak, the betrayal, the long nights of waiting for closure that never came. I had survived the weight of love lost, the kind of love that had once defined me. And yet, here I was, still breathing, still moving, still capable of tenderness. I picked up a blank sheet of paper and stared at it for a long time. My hands trembled slightly, but not from fear this time. There was something almost sacred about the emptiness of the page, an invitation, a beginning. I began to write again. Not to him. Not anymore. The first letter I wrote that day was to forgiveness. Not the kind that excuses or forgets, but the kind that releases. You don't owe him peace, I wrote. You owe yourself freedom. Then I wrote to gratitude. Thank you for teaching me that love is not measured by how long it lasts, but by how deeply it changes us. And then, finally, I wrote to myself. I'm proud of you, I wrote, and the words came easily this time. You kept living, even when it hurt. You kept your heart open, even when it broke. You are not the same, and that's okay. Maybe you were never meant to be. I didn't seal those letters. I didn't even fold them. I left them on the desk, ink still glistening in the fading light. They weren't meant to be sent. They were meant to be witnessed. By me. Writing became my ritual, my small act of reclamation, a quiet ceremony for the pieces of myself I thought I had lost forever. Each evening, I'd light a candle, pour a cup of tea, and write, sometimes to the past, sometimes to the future, sometimes to the simple, steady rhythm of the present. I stopped searching for meaning in his absence and began finding it in my own words. There were nights when I cried while writing and others when I smiled without realizing it. I started to see the letters as conversations, not with ghosts, but with the parts of myself that still needed to be heard. One night, I wrote something that startled me. Healing is not linear, I began. It's not a straight line from pain to peace. Some days you'll wake up feeling light, almost whole, and other days the weight will return without warning. Both are part of the journey. Grief and hope can coexist. They must. The hands that tremble in sorrow are the same hands that can build, create, and embrace a future that once seemed impossible. When I finished writing that line, I sat back and let it sink in. It felt true, more true than anything I had written before. For the first time, I understood that healing wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about carrying it differently, lighter, with grace. Weeks passed. The stack of new letters grew taller, while the old ones sat quietly in their box, no longer a wound, but a witness. Sometimes I'd open it, just to remind myself how far I had come. The pain in those pages no longer scared me, it humbled me. One evening, after finishing another letter, this one addressed simply to tomorrow, I decided to do something I hadn't planned. I took the old letters outside, to the small patch of earth behind the house. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of thawing soil. The stars were out, distant but kind. I placed the letters in a small tin box and buried them beneath the tree, not as an act of forgetting, but of gratitude. They had done their work. They had held my pain when I couldn't. As I pressed the earth over the box, I whispered softly, "Thank you." Then I stood there for a long time, my breath misting in the air, my hands covered in soil, my heart strangely light. When I went back inside, I washed my hands, lit another candle, and wrote one last letter for the night. "Dear me," I began, "you are allowed to love again, not just others, but yourself. You are allowed to build a life from the ashes. You are allowed to hope." The candle flickered, and for a moment, it felt as if the flame itself was nodding in agreement. That night, as I climbed into bed, I realized something simple yet profound. I no longer needed his answers. I no longer needed the past to make sense. What mattered was that I had learned to speak again in my own voice, on my own terms. The letters I never sent had become letters that saved me. The first time I woke before the sun, it wasn't on purpose. Sleep had become unreliable, drifting in and out like a tide that no longer followed the moon. I made my way to the kitchen, barefoot, the floorboards cool against my skin. The air was still, heavy with that peculiar silence that belongs only to the hours before dawn. I turned on the kettle. The sound of water heating filled the small kitchen, a low, comforting hum. When it clicked off, the hiss of steam felt almost alive. I spooned coffee into my favorite chipped mug, the one with the tiny crack along the rim, the one he never liked using. I held it close, breathing in the bitter scent that once reminded me of shared mornings. Now it was just mine. I carried the cup to the window. The sky was a deep gray, somewhere between night and morning. Then slowly, light began to spread. Faint at first, then brighter, spilling over the rooftops like liquid gold. The world was waking up, but gently. A delivery truck rumbled in the distance. A lone bird called out from a power line. The city was stretching its limbs, unaware that I was there, watching. I had never noticed how beautiful that hour could be, how it made the world seem softer, quieter. For so long, mornings had felt like battles, waking up to absence, facing the echo of someone who wasn't coming back. But that morning, something felt different. It wasn't happiness exactly, more like the ghost of peace brushing against my shoulder. I sipped the coffee slowly, letting its warmth anchor me. And in that stillness, I realized something small but profound. The world hadn't stopped turning when he left. I had. For months, I had been living in pause, waiting for pain to make sense, waiting for closure that never came, waiting for the day I would wake up and not feel like half a person. But as the sky lightened, I began to understand. Maybe healing wasn't about waiting. Maybe it was about noticing the smell of coffee in the air, the soft clink of the spoon against the mug, the warmth spreading through my palms, the way dawn always, unfailingly returned. That morning marked the beginning of a quiet ritual. Every day after that, I woke early. I'd sit by the same window, wrap myself in a blanket, and watch as the first rays of sunlight crept across the buildings. I never rushed it. I just sat there, breathing, letting the world unfold in front of me. And with each passing day, I began to see things differently. The small things, the ones I once dismissed, became anchors. The sound of rain against the window, the scent of wet earth after a storm, the laughter of children running to school. Even the way leaves trembled on trees before falling. These weren't just background noises anymore. They were proof of life continuing, of beauty existing even when I had forgotten to look for it. Some mornings, I'd write while the coffee cooled beside me. Not the heavy, tear-stained letters I used to write, but simple things, thoughts, fragments, half-formed ideas, lists of what I was grateful for, the warmth of sunlight on my face, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the fact that I was still here. It sounds small, doesn't it? But when your world has shattered, small things are the scaffolding that hold you up. Sometimes I thought about him, not with anger anymore, not even with sadness, just acknowledgement. Like a closed book resting on a shelf. It had been a story once, but it no longer demanded to be read. One morning, maybe 3 months after the first, I decided to leave the house. I hadn't gone out early in a long time. I wrapped a scarf around my neck, the same one I used to wear when we'd walk together on winter mornings, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of dew and faint wood smoke. The streetlights were still on, their glow faint against the brightening sky. I walked slowly past quiet houses and sleepy gardens until I reached the park at the end of the street. The park was empty except for an old man feeding pigeons near the fountain. His movements were unhurried, gentle. The birds fluttered around him, their wings catching the first gold of sunrise. I watched for a moment, then found a bench and sat down. The trees swayed lightly in the morning breeze. The sound of their rustling was soft, like whispers exchanged between old friends. The smell of wet grass filled the air. I closed my eyes and listened, really listened, and in that moment, for the first time in what felt like years, I felt completely alive. Not happy, not healed, but present. When I opened my eyes, the light had changed. The world seemed painted anew, every color brighter, every sound clearer. It struck me then. Life had started to feel like mine again, not perfect, not whole, but mine. That realization didn't come with fireworks or tears. It came quietly, like the dawn itself. As I walked home, I passed a bakery. The door was propped open, and the scent of fresh bread drifted out, warm and familiar. I bought a small loaf and carried it home, feeling almost like a child bringing back a secret treasure. Back in my kitchen, I sliced the bread, spread butter that melted instantly, and poured another cup of coffee. I sat by the window again, the same place where I had watched countless sunrises alone, and this time I smiled. Not the forced smile I had worn in the months after he left. Not the brittle one I used to offer strangers when they asked how I was doing. This was different, quiet, real, unhurried. The smile of someone who had stopped running from herself. Days turned into weeks, and that morning ritual became my anchor. It wasn't just about the coffee or the sunrise. It was about choosing to begin each day with gentleness. Some mornings, I'd hum softly, old songs I hadn't thought about in years. Others, I'd whisper small affirmations under my breath. I'm okay. I'm learning. I'm still here. And slowly, those words became true. One morning, while walking through the park again, I saw a woman sitting on a bench, crying quietly. Her face was turned away, but the shape of her grief was unmistakable, the same hollow stillness I had once carried. For a moment, I almost walked past, but something made me stop. I sat beside her, not saying a word. After a while, she looked up, startled but not afraid. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling. It gets easier, I said softly. Not quickly, not all at once, but it does. She nodded, and for a brief moment, we shared the kind of silence that needs no explanation. When I walked away, I realized that perhaps healing wasn't just for me. Maybe it was something to be shared, quietly, gently, like a cup of coffee offered to a friend on a cold morning. That evening, as I prepared for bed, I noticed how the house no longer felt like a museum of memories. The air felt lighter. The shadows seemed softer. Even the walls, once silent witnesses to heartbreak, seemed to hum with a quiet calm. I looked at my reflection in the window, not searching for who I used to be, but recognizing who I had become. A woman with her own story, her own rhythm, her own dawn. And in that reflection, I saw the faintest glimmer of something I hadn't dared to name in a long time: hope. The next morning, I woke before the alarm, as I always did. I brewed my coffee, sat by the window, and watched as the world slowly lit up again. The city stirred, children's laughter floated through the streets, and the first golden light touched the buildings. I wrapped my hands around the mug, breathing in the warmth, and whispered softly to myself, "Good morning." And for once, I meant it. That evening, the house was silent, the kind of silence that doesn't echo but settles, heavy and still. I turned on the bathroom light, its soft amber glow spilling across the tiles, and for a long time I just stood there, watching my reflection emerge from the dimness. For months I had avoided mirrors. They had become cruel companions, showing me a woman I no longer recognized. Eyes swollen from sleepless nights, hair unkempt, a face that carried stories I didn't want to tell. But that night was different. That night, I looked and didn't flinch. The woman staring back wasn't the one who had once pleaded for love that had already left the room. She wasn't the one who measured her worth through someone else's approval. No, the woman in the mirror had changed. Her eyes were still soft, but now they held a glimmer of something I hadn't seen in a long time: strength. There were faint lines around her mouth, carved not by age, but by endurance, evidence of laughter that had survived grief. Her shoulders were no longer hunched beneath invisible weight. They carried dignity instead of sorrow. Her lips curved into a small, quiet smile, one that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. For the first time in what felt like years, I whispered aloud, to her, to me, "You made it." It wasn't triumphant, it was gentle, a whisper of relief that trembled through the silence like a small, sacred truth. As I stood there, I thought about forgiveness, not the kind written in apologies or wrapped in grand gestures, but the kind that starts within. I realized I didn't need to forgive him. That part of my story had already closed itself. What I needed was to forgive me, the woman who stayed too long, who silenced her instincts, who thought loving someone meant losing herself. Forgiving myself wasn't easy. It wasn't a single moment, but 1,000 small choices. Choosing to smile again, choosing to sleep without replaying memories, choosing to breathe without waiting for the ache to return. I thought of all the versions of myself I had been: the hopeful girl who believed in forever, the broken woman who feared tomorrow, the quiet soul who rebuilt her mornings one coffee cup at a time. And I realized every version of me had tried her best with what she knew. That understanding, that compassion for my own journey, was the beginning of peace. In that mirror, I didn't see loss anymore. I saw a mosaic, the fragments of who I had been, pieced together into something whole. The cracks didn't shame me. They shimmered, catching the light like veins of gold in porcelain. And in the soft hum of that evening, I felt something stir deep inside. A pulse, steady and quiet. Hope. Not the naive hope of starting over with someone new. Not the kind that waits for rescue. But a hope rooted in self, in the belief that I could love again. Not him, not the past, but life itself. The small, beautiful things. The taste of morning coffee. The warmth of sunlight through curtains. The laughter of friends who stayed. The sound of my own heart, steady, resilient, alive. I touched the mirror one last time, tracing my reflection as though sealing a promise. No longer broken, no longer defined by what ended, but reborn, in stillness, in strength, in grace. That night, I turned off the light and walked away, not from my reflection, but toward my life. Spring came quietly that year, not with grand fanfare or sudden bloom, but with shy whispers of green after months of gray. The air smelled new, damp soil, budding leaves, the faint sweetness of rain. I decided to plant a garden in the small patch of earth behind the house. The idea came suddenly, though perhaps it had been growing in me all along, a need to put my hands into something that lived, something that grew. I started with lilies, the same kind he once brought home. White, elegant, perfumed. For a moment, the memory stung. I almost put the bulbs back in their box. But then I thought, maybe it's time those lilies belonged to me. Each morning, I dug and watered, my fingers sinking into cool soil. There was something healing about it, the patience it required, the quiet it offered. Nature didn't rush, it didn't demand. It simply trusted that beneath the surface, life was preparing to rise again. Day after day, I watched small shoots push through the dirt, fragile yet stubborn. They reminded me of myself, how I had emerged from darkness, tender but determined to live. The garden became my companion. I would talk to it as the sun climbed, whispering my thoughts into the breeze. Sometimes I laughed at myself for doing it, but deep down, I knew the earth was listening. Weeks passed. The lilies opened, their white petals catching the morning light. Around them, daisies danced in clusters, and tiny wildflowers claimed corners of their own. The backyard, once neglected, now felt alive. It wasn't just flowers that bloomed there. It was forgiveness, patience, grace. And then, years later, after time had softened memories into something distant and tender, I saw him again. It was at a family gathering, one of those occasions where faces blur into polite laughter and conversations about weather and work. I hadn't expected him to be there. For a moment, my heart paused, as if recognizing an old song I hadn't heard in years. He looked older, not in a sad way, just real, the way time changes us all. His smile was hesitant, unsure, almost shy. I felt no anger, no longing, no ache, just a quiet understanding. He nodded. I nodded back. A small gesture, but in that moment, it said everything words couldn't. We didn't speak. There was no need. Our story had been written long ago, its pages closed. Later, as I walked away from the noise of the gathering, I felt light, unburdened in a way I hadn't known was possible. That night, back home, I sat by the garden again. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their colors glowing in the fading light. And I understood something that had taken me years to learn. Endings are not always tragedies. Sometimes they are beginnings disguised as farewells. Sometimes they are the spaces where life pauses, not to break us, but to teach us how to bloom differently. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and rose, I whispered to the wind, "I am enough. I have always been enough." The words felt like a prayer, not to anyone else, but to the woman I had become. I leaned back, feeling the earth beneath me, solid and forgiving. The scent of lilies drifted through the air, mingling with the hum of the night. And for the first time in a very long while, I wasn't waiting for life to begin again. It already had.